certain matters commence with murmurs. Initially, they linger close to your ears, merely an indistinct sensation. Subsequently, that sensation permeates your skin, transforming into a gaze, a caress, an instant. Ultimately, you arrive at a juncture when you can no longer feign its absence. Those instances were what frightened me the most. I am Esther, aged 48. I have endeavored to act correctly throughout my entire life. I anticipated that my second marriage would provide me with tranquility. However, Gabriel did not afford me such solace. He imparted loneliness to me. His absence had persisted in my life for such an extended period that I ceased to perceive it. At least, until I began to lose myself in another's sight. Jake, the offspring of Gabriel from his initial marriage. A 28-year-old man, robust and mature, who commands attention. Upon our initial encounter, he exhibited a sense of aloofness. Nevertheless, as time progressed, the distance between us diminished. He was excessively close and warm, a fact we both acknowledged, although we pretended otherwise. On that night, when the electricity failed, I was alone at home. I entered the kitchen in search of a candle, although I was unable to dispel the disquieting sensation within me. I contacted Gabriel. "What would you like me to do, Esther? I am now away from town." His voice was imbued with impatience, reflecting his typical indifference. "I am solitary," I stated. A brief pause ensued. Subsequently, his reply arrived. "I will dispatch Jake." I remained silent, while an inward tremor coursed through me. 30 minutes later, Jake arrived at the door. A flashlight held in his hand. The recognizable expression on his visage. The individual who consistently spoke excessively without conveying meaningful content. "Your father remarked that you were in a state of agitation," his tone composed yet tinged with a mischievous undertone. I simply dislike solitude," I responded. I suddenly recognized that my fingers were clenching the edge of the doorframe excessively. Jake entered. There had been a slight rainfall. His leather jacket was moist, and his big shoulders shone under the faint external light. I closed the door. "The electricity remains unavailable," I murmured. Jake's gaze fixed upon mine. "Is that detrimental?" A realization occurred within me, and I understood that I could no longer feign my true feelings. Jake inclined his head little while remaining at the threshold. He then raised the spotlight, directing its beam straight at my face. I squinted as my eyes acclimated, yet I sensed his stare descending. I was attired in my customary loungewear, a sheer nightgown that scarcely extended to my knees. I was not wearing any undergarments. I was on the verge of retiring for the night when the power was interrupted. I slung a light cardigan over my shoulders, but did not secure it. My feet were unshod. Jake's gaze rested on my ankles briefly, before gradually ascending. "Regardless," he stated, his voice emerging softly. "Take a seat on the couch, I will inspect the fuse box." I experienced an unusual sense of discomfort. I felt anxious, however I was unaware of the cause. Jake resided independently, about 15 minutes distant by automobile. His personal residence, his individual routine, his distinct existence. At this moment, he was present in this house with me. I quietly approached the couch in the living area while Jake proceeded towards the fuse box, flashlight in hand. I inhaled deeply, interlocking my fingers in my lap. That was the moment of my realization. My entire body felt taut. He activated the switch, click. For a brief moment, the lights flickered, but then darkness ensued once more. Jake exhaled audibly. He murmured that there was likely excessive load on one of the circuits. He thereafter directed his spotlight towards the kitchen. He stated, "Allow me to investigate the cause," as he entered. I was unaware that he entered the kitchen. I presumed he had descended to the basement because the fuse box was adjacent to the basement door. Subsequently, an object descended. A resounding metallic clang reverberated through the darkness. I leaped. "Jake?" I rose abruptly and proceeded toward the darkened kitchen. "Is Jake present?" No response. I advanced another step. The moonlight streaming through the kitchen window created subtle shadows, yet everything remained obscured in darkness. I was unable to see him, yet I sensed something. Emotion. As I was on the verge of turning, my chest impacted a rigid object. A corpse. Jacob. The flashlight fell from his grasp, its beam directed to the side. His warm, solid physique was in contact with mine, and for an instant, a jolt coursed through me. Instinctively, I attempted to retreat, but Jake was positioned directly in front of me. "Did you also enter the kitchen?" he inquired, his voice subdued, nearly a murmur. I was unaware of your location," I stated, my breath uneven. Jake's hand lightly grazed my waist, perhaps merely for stability, although my body interpreted it as something significantly more. If this is your initial exposure to such confessions, and you wish to provide your support, please subscribe to my channel and activate notifications. Before we proceed, believe me, you will not desire the narrative to conclude. In the obscurity, we were unable to perceive one another, we could just sense. At that moment, I saw that the attraction we had been feigning did exist and had intensified beyond the point of dismissal. The only sound in the profound silence was our breathing. Jake's breath was overly proximate, and the only barrier preventing our gaze from meeting was the surrounding darkness. I rested my hand on his chest, attempting to retreat somewhat, yet he remained stationary, as did I. He said, "Esther." The mere utterance of my name in his voice elicited a shudder within me. I had to regain my composure. I subtly shook my head, inhaled unsteadily, and compelled my speech to sound regular. "What is the issue?" I inquired. Jake gradually retracted his hand from my waist, however he remained in proximity. The flashlight had already fallen, and the kitchen was almost engulfed in darkness. A mere sliver of moonlight penetrated the window, throwing gentle shadows across the surroundings. He whispered that he believed it to be the washing machine. It was likely operational when the power was interrupted and is attempting to restart. I gulped audibly. "Therefore, we must disconnect it, correct?" Jake acquiesced, but shown reluctance. A palpable tension permeated the atmosphere, an invisible yet distinctly perceived presence. Ultimately, I observed the contour of his form alter as he approached the washing machine, his silhouette scarcely discernible in the subdued illumination. A resounding clang reverberated across the room. I recoiled. "What was that?" I murmured. Jake bent down but raised his head slightly, his lips forming a subtle smile. He stated that he believed he had toppled something. His voice was composed, excessively composed. He grasped the plug and removed it. I sighed profoundly, leaning against the counter to regain my composure. My pulse remained elevated. I instructed me to remain composed. How was I expected to accomplish that? Despite the gloom, nothing had altered. Feelings do not require light to be experienced. Jake resumed an upright posture, and I sensed his gaze upon me. "What is the reason behind your apparent tension?" he inquired, his tone somewhat playful, although beneath it was an underlying sentiment. "I am not tense," I retorted instantly. However, Jake seems unconvinced. I perceived his footsteps in the darkness. One footfall, followed by another. He acknowledged, speaking deliberately. "I am also tense." A constriction occurred within me. I was uncertain about how to proceed. Should I withdraw? Ought I to search elsewhere in the room? However, I did not engage in any of those activities. Because Jake was directly in my line of sight. I had permitted him to approach this closely. Momentarily, I was uncertain about the forthcoming events. Jake remained in position, his voice subdued, and our bodies were nearly in contact. At that point, I recognized that reactivating the power had only become a pretext. We required no justifications to prolong this time. However, abruptly, Jake retracted. He stated, his voice still gruff, "Allow me to address the fuse first." I merely acquiesced with a nod. I was unable to articulate any response. Jake exited the kitchen and proceeded to the fuse box. Despite hearing his footsteps diminish, the burden upon me remained same. Subsequently, click, followed by a little pause. A quick burst of light illuminated the kitchen, leaving me feeling vulnerable. The darkness enveloped me like a protective shield. However, at this moment, all matters were transparent. Jake pivoted back. The faint illumination accentuated his visage, and his leather jacket, still moist from the rain, appeared even more somber beneath the light. He responded with a faint smile. Issue resolved. He inclined his head slightly, observing me, his eyebrows elevating little. However, you still appear tense. I ingested. I was suddenly astonished. That is all. Jake emitted a faint chuckle, however his gaze remained unwavering. He stated, advancing further into the kitchen. Is there an alternative rationale? The sensation within me reawakened. The disquieting yet exhilarating sensation. I am uncertain. I conceded. Did my voice tremble? Jake advanced another step. He was now positioned directly in front of me. Esther, you have undergone a transformation recently, he remarked, his tone subdued yet intent. My respiration accelerated. What is your meaning? Jake maintained his gaze. You were once more composed and resilient. However, you currently experience a sense of disorientation, correct? Something within me tightened. Jake, However, I was unable to complete my statement. Due to his correctness. Gabriel had abandoned me for years, even in his presence, it felt as though he was absent. Initially, I remained in anticipation. Subsequently, I relinquished my efforts. Subsequently, I became aware that I no longer recognized my own identity. I had become feeble, disoriented, and inconspicuous. Jake observed it. He positioned his hand on the table, near yet not excessively so. He was not ensnaring me, but a slight movement on my part would enable me to make contact with him. I care for you, he stated, his tone gentle yet firm. A tremor coursed through me. You feign indifference, he said, yet you do feel, do you not? Gabriel abandoned you. He professed his love for you, although he never demonstrated it. You acclimated to that. However, Esther. He extended his hand, his fingertips gently grazing my hair. I observe you. Suddenly, everything I had been suppressing became lodged in my throat. My eyes stung, yet I declined to meet his gaze. However, I was unable to control it. There was also something in his gaze. Isolation, comprehension, and an additional element. I inhaled deeply and retracted slightly, although Jake remained stationary. I was not always this way, I murmured. However, I am currently uncertain of my own identity. Jake negated with a shake of his head. You remain unchanged. It is essential to retain the information. Subsequently, tears cascaded down my cheeks. I quickly raised my hand to wipe tears away, but Jake merely inclined his head and observed me. For what duration have you experienced these feelings? He inquired. The question was excessively challenging to address, however I merely muttered my response. An extended duration. Jake maintained his gaze. I concur. That was the final factor that shattered my remaining resistance. This moment transcended my individual experience. He was solitary as well. He desired recognition and significance. The silence in the kitchen intensified as my tears continued to descend. Jake refrained from judgment, he simply comprehended. Having been solitary for an extended period, this warmth enveloping me seemed utterly unfamiliar. However, it also felt ominously appropriate. Jake exhaled slowly, raised his hand off the table, and reclined slightly. He urged, gesturing toward the living room. You appear fatigued. It is unacceptable to commemorate my repair of the fuse in this manner. I compelled a little smile, however an inward tremor persisted within me. We entered the living room together. Jake occupied one end of the couch, while I positioned myself next to him. He had removed his leather jacket. His t-shirt adhered to his body, remaining somewhat moist. He traversed his fingers through his hair. He appeared fatigued. I was fatigued as well. However, not exclusively this evening. For an extended period. Engulfed in the void I had been submerged in for an extended period, I was unaware when I let my head to lean against Jake's shoulder. His physique was heated and firm. For the first time in my life, I experienced the sensation of being genuinely embraced. His respiration diminished, mine did as well. Before I realized it, my eyelids closed. Upon awakening, the room was faintly illuminated. For a brief interval, I was disoriented regarding my location. Subsequently, I perceived it. My head remained positioned on Jake's shoulder. Moreover, his head was inclined slightly towards mine as well. My breath was momentarily halted. Jake awakened. Gradually, his eyes unsealed. He elevated his head slightly. Sufficient for our gazes to intersect. For a brief moment, we simply gazed at one another. However, that expression. The gaze conveyed profound meaning. A warmth enveloped me. My heart rate accelerated. Jake's eyes descended to my lips. Subsequently, he inclined forward. My breath faltered. He initially kissed me slowly and with hesitation. However, all that we had been repressing culminated at that instant. My hands autonomously glided over his shoulders. Jake's hand grasped my waist, drawing me nearer. This was the culmination. Something long concealed. An overlooked matter. Emerging from the ruins. This time, I desired it. I reciprocated his kiss. Completely. Intentionally. I recognized that nothing would ever remain unchanged. Upon Jake's eventual withdrawal, we were both panting. We exchanged glances. His gaze continued to scrutinize me. Continuing to desire me. For the first time, I was not attempting to evade it. Jake maintained his gaze. Conversely, he murmured, his tone profound and deliberate. I had harbored feelings for you for an extended period. My breathing was irregular, yet his words elicited a profound response within me. An entity that had been concealed for years. I gulped, releasing the anguish within me, and advanced toward him. I maintained eye contact. I allowed all that I had been repressing to emerge. I have never experienced anything that appropriate before. Jake acted without hesitation. Not even for an instant. He merely observed me. Subsequently, we both relocated. Simultaneously. Initially sluggish. Proceed more swiftly. Our lips collided one again. This time, there was no indecision. Unrestrained. There is no denial. My hands ascended to his shoulders. His hands grasped my waist, drawing me nearer. My heart was racing. While we kissed, my fingertips glided along his arms. Subsequently, my hand extended towards my straps. My breath halted as my fingers grasped them. Gradually, I lowered them. Jake became immobilized while observing me. However, his gaze remained fixed on mine. He was observing me. He was expressing affection towards me. Consequently, I unhesitatingly allowed myself to descend upon the couch. Jake drew in a sharp breath. At that instant, I realized. He had no option for retreat. Jake positioned his leg on the couch, orienting his face towards me as I reclined. I observed him liberating himself from his garments. It impacted me more profoundly than I can articulate. He comprehended me. He was concerned for my well-being. He was youthful and extraordinarily attractive. For the first time, I experienced a sense of companionship. At that moment, I observed the gradual motion of his hand. I adored it. I experienced something more profound than anything I had previously encountered. This time, I was unwilling to yield to exhilaration. I desired to yield to emotion. I was not solitary. I could perceive that throughout my entire body. I opened my eyes and allowed my hands to descend from Jake's shoulders. I secured my arms firmly around my legs. Jake, panting and hot, appeared captivating. At that same instant, my body became rigid. My nails seemed to be nearly penetrating my thighs. My legs became entirely immobilized. With a resounding exclamation, I relinquished myself. I was automatically imploring Jake to reciprocate. It was a brief duration. He paid attention. I experienced profound warmth within me. Subsequently, I murmured a gentle expression of gratitude. Upon lying down next to me, he was utterly breathless. We were completely silent. I listened to his heartbeat, anticipating the stabilization of his breathing. Before I realized it, I had succumbed to sleep in that location. I was aware that Gabriel would not return home. At that moment, nothing else held significance. A profound sensation of relaxation and tranquility enveloped me as I succumbed to slumber. Upon awakening that morning, I was unaware that Jake had a surprise in store for me. I had never awakened with such happiness before. I had never experienced such profound love that I felt compelled to leap into a man's embrace the moment I awoke. However, this time everything was poised to advance even further. Remain attentive, as this narrative is not concluded. If you have reached this point, it is evident that this narrative has captivated you profoundly. There is far more to convey, and you do not like to overlook any detail. Please click the follow button, activate notifications, and leave a comment below.